Is that recall referendum to oust Venezuela's president still worth it? The Electoral Commission making sure the vote can only take place next year, which means no snap election. The vice president would take over should Nicolas Maduro, the deeply unpopular successor to Hugo Chavez, be booted out of office over the crashing of the economy. Under the rules announced on Tuesday, it's going to be enough of a challenge to get the 4 million signatures needed to stage the referendum. So how do you fix the nation that sits on the world's largest known oil reserves? What measures to stop hyperinflation, restart a despondent economy, and heal a country that seems more polarized than ever? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about Immovable Maduro and the situation in Venezuela. With us to talk about it, Vincent Olive, the author of Who Killed Simon Bolivar, a Venezuelan writer based here in Paris. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
From New York, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, who teaches at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Always a pleasure to see you, sir. From Mexico City, George Chiquirello Maher, author of Building the Commune, the Radical Democracy in Venezuela. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
And from Washington, Michael McCarthy of American University's Center for Latin American Studies. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The rules have been laid out by the Electoral Commission. No vote before January, and Venezuela's opposition will need to collect 20% of all voter signatures in each state during a 3-day period that starts on October the 26th. Yuka Royer has more.
Central Caracas came to a standstill as transport workers blocked roads. Anti-government protests have become a near fixture in the Venezuelan capital as the country plunges deeper into recession. The opposition's drive to oust President Nicolas Maduro has been gathering pace, with enough signatures collected to start the referendum procedures. But in a fresh blow, the country's electoral board ruled out a national recall vote this year. Opposition leaders remain defiant.
This statement, this press release just issued by the National Electoral Council, is yet another proof of the government's fear. It's afraid of the Venezuelan people's decision to overturn the government of Nicolas Maduro.
The opposition may have cleared the first stage of the complex referendum process, but they will now have to fulfill the second requirement, to collect around 4 million signatures, or 20% of registered voters in each state, in just 3 days. Only then an actual referendum could take place. An equal or higher number of votes than those gained by Maduro in his election will be needed to revoke him. The timing of the plebiscite is crucial. If a yes vote takes place before the 10th of January and Maduro is removed from office, there will be fresh presidential elections. But if the vote takes place after that date, then Maduro's vice president will take over and serve out his remaining term, meaning the socialists will stay in power until the end of 2018.
Yeah, lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. John says the Electoral Tribunal rules there will be no recall vote against President Maduro in 2016. This will drive people to the streets. Vincent Olive, are you surprised by the Electoral Commission's ruling?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think it was pretty obvious from the start that they were trying to drag their feet and make it very difficult for the opposition to establish the recall referendum. They've done everything, and it's also important to underline the fact that these rules that have been established now with the 20% are full of a number of illegalities, too. So it's as if the people that are in charge of this are changing the rules every time and making it more and more difficult.
Is it worth it to have this, to try to stage this referendum, to go out and get all those signatures for 3 days?
Well, it's very difficult because the opposition right now is in a catch-22. As the political analyst Naki Sotopara says, the opposition has two options: either reject this and not go for the recall referendum, in which case you don't have one, or try to achieve this almost inaccomplishable task and then not have the recall referendum. So either way, it's very difficult, and it really is opening up the opposition to other routes that may be protests, manifestations, and who knows what else, unfortunately.
All right, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, the opposition in a catch-22, what's your prediction?
So I think that just for the sake of maintaining unity, it's important to continue going through the motions of trying to organize something, despite the fact that the government has made clear, really several months, if perhaps up to a year before this decision was reached, it's been becoming more and more clear that the goalpost was going to continue moving away from the opposition, and the football was going to keep getting snatched away at the last minute, to use the old Charlie Brown metaphor. And that's what we've seen. The regime has focused very clearly on buying itself time, and the opposition has had to either declare itself outside the system entirely or attempt to work within the confines of the system despite the deck being stacked against it. I think that they'll likely continue to go through those motions, even though it's becoming ever more clearly a fool's errand. That said, there is going to be much more pressure on Maduro at this point, because there's factions within the government as well that would like a bit of a facelift. And there will be more and more disunity, potentially, within the government as different figures attempt to position themselves for the vice presidency, which can be reappointed at any time. And the person, Aristobulu, who is vice president right now, may not necessarily be vice president, and different people would benefit or stand to benefit or gain by who's in that musical chair when January 10th takes place, and when an actual change may happen without putting the control over government institutions by Chavismo at risk.
All right, George Chicarello-Mayer, reaction on 2 points there. First of all, the moving of those goalposts, as it were, and secondly, the vice president today may not be the president tomorrow if a recall referendum takes place.
Sure, I think that's, on the second part, I think that's absolutely the case. And it's a little, it would be unfortunate if Aristobulu were changed. I think he's a very reasonable figure. He's someone who has a great deal of on-the-ground practical experience in putting democracy at work in Venezuela, and he's someone who really could, balance the forces and put this government back on its feet if this government were to change after January. On moving the goalpost, I mean, there is some of that. Of course, I'm not here to deny that. I think it's worth framing and understanding this in its context, however. It is thanks to Chavismo, it's thanks to the Constitution written by the Chavistas and the grassroots that there's the possibility of recalling this government. For example, I live in Mexico, where the president is massively unpopular, and there are no headlines about the immovable Enrique Peña Nieto. It's the possibility of upholding this constitutional promise that's really raising the questions in Venezuela, and it is the right of the people. And I think, I think there will be a referendum. It looks very likely that Maduro could be recalled in this referendum. He's incredibly unpopular. At the same time, the opposition is very unpopular as well, and has not necessarily gained that lost support for Maduro. So I think there is a question. We need to remember, though, there has been a recall in Venezuela in 2004. It took about the same length of time to schedule and structure and establish and go through all of the steps. The opposition lost in a very clean, vote, and so we know that this is something that has happened before. And the opposition itself delayed this process by about 4 months by not starting the recall due to internal dissension until April.
Didn't wait until April? The opposition didn't get its act together fast enough, Vincent Olivi?
No, the opposition really went through a couple of problems really setting it up. But the problem is, too, that when the opposition actually started to present the recall referendum, the governing council, the CNE, did not respect the date, which was the 9th of September. They should have said what they said today. So we've lost a lot of time during that process, and they keep on inventing these coming up with these rules. Now it's 20% of each and every state. We didn't do that for Chavez. It's not true that when Chavez was recalled in 2004, that was the case. It was very different. When Chavez was recalled, you didn't have the votes open from 8 to 4. You had them open during a whole lot of time, and it was on the weekend. So obviously, it's not the same case as in the 2004 recall referendum against Hugo Chavez.
Reactions on the hashtag F24
jump in here. If I can jump in
sure,
here,
go ahead.
I think it's also important. It's also important to recognize that the Electoral Tribunal has quite a bit of technical capacity to organize an election. If you remember, after Hugo Chavez passed away, the country held snap elections within 30 days for a new president. So although the Electoral Tribunal has said it's going to take its time to study the signatures that are submitted through the biometrical system of the voting technology in Venezuela, it's quite clear that they're going, that they're dragging their feet, and they have the capacity that they've demonstrated, before. And just to go back to the earlier question about what is the opposition strategy decision going forward, this really isn't a new ball game. The opposition has been facing this challenge of whether or not to press for sort of incremental progressive developments or to go for it all at once, right? And in fact, they've been doing both in one way or another, if you consider that they're using the institutional channels and they're using street mobilization together. So I don't think that the decision they make today, they're scheduled to make a decision today about responding to these conditions, is going to really reflect a dramatic change. In Venezuela, the political situation is going to continue to entail both institutional-based processes as well as street-based protest and in fact very vocal anti-government demonstrations to try and make clear to the international community that a majority of Venezuelans are simply fed up with this government and they want change.
A reaction on the hashtag F24 debate. Michael, this one says, Venezuela's finances have been mismanaged for decades. Painting this solely as the failure of socialism is stupid. Your reaction to that?
Well, I wouldn't even call it socialism, so that's a separate matter. But really, the most interesting part of this story of economic collapse in Venezuela is that it's not about the oil. This is about the failure of a political model in which the government did not save for the rainy days that we're seeing today. It did not efficiently manage the state enterprises that it purchased through nationalization processes. And it never came up with a real strategy of strategic governance for broadening the economic base of productivity in the country. And in fact, if you just look around the region in South America, you can see that other governments were able to make such pivots to have strategic governance. If you look at Ecuador and Bolivia, those are other governments where you have left-wing administrations in power. They're also quite dependent on natural resources, and they are not suffering nearly as badly as Venezuela as a result of the collapse of the super commodity cycle. So in Venezuela, the story is neither about socialism nor is it about oil. It's about a failed political model created by Chavismo.
George Chicarillo-Maher, you agree?
Yes and no. On the one hand, I think that list of factors that was just laid out is not divorceable from the question of oil. Of course, there are ways to manage these things better, and I agree absolutely that certain governments have managed these questions better. At the same time, the question of productive base, the question of dependency on importations in Venezuela is a long-standing, problem of decades, decades and decades, having to do with what happens when these oil prices are high. Absolutely, more reserves could have been put aside. I really actually, though, think that the root of this economic problem has everything to do with the currency control system and the slowness to react to the currency crisis that began to grow in 2013. The Maduro government should have transformed the currency control system, should have liberated those controls much earlier, and I think would have found itself in a very different situation. The reserves would not have been sucked dry so quickly. The rampant corruption that was never eliminated under Chavismo would not have expanded so dramatically in the way that it did, given the incentives of this black market for the U.S. dollar. And so I think there are lots of things that the Venezuelan government could have done. At the same time, these things are all tied to oil in a lot of ways, and they're also all tied to the long-standing problems of a political system that depends fundamentally on this commodity.
Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, at the end of the day, it's a lot about oil.
I agree completely. The example that's being used of comparing Ecuador or Bolivia to Venezuela overlooks, I think, something that's very fundamental in this story, which is the fact that Venezuela, which is a medium-sized, lower middle-income country, attempted to step up under Chavez to become a regional spearhead of a new movement. And the way that was done was by sharing a lot of that oil wealth with small Caribbean countries to shore up support in, for example, the Organization of American States and other internationalist bodies. Of that system, Bolivia and Ecuador were receiving aid from Venezuela. They were getting subsidized oil. So Venezuela was paying out into a system that that these other countries were getting benefits from. So as a result, the fall of oil and the fact that they didn't manage to store much for a rainy day is because a lot of those stores went into other countries' stores. And Venezuela's system had an illusion, I feel, of permanence right from the get-go, that Chavez had changed everything and that Chavismo, at least within the government, was a done deal and that it could never really come under threat to the extent that it has now. So a lot of these constitutional mechanisms, such as the recall referendum possibility, such as the various amounts of very high unilateralism with which the Venezuelan executive can function in practice. All of this was something that was undertaken with an idea that that executive would always be probably Hugo Chavez. It was a system that was made to run on big promises and high charisma. And the big promises are still there, but the charisma's gone. And the oil money, which was the other key factor there, is also gone. So at this point, it's consistent damage control. It's a lot of short-term decision-making to put out the fire that the government sees right in front of it, even at the cost of being able to manage the problems that are almost certainly going to come down further down the road. The can keeps getting kicked further. And I think that we're seeing that come to fruition right now. We're seeing the promises that the government has made, for example, subsidized oil to Cuba, long after oil prices had collapsed, long after Venezuela was having to squeeze its import sector, causing significant amounts of shortage and of scarcity on the ground for Venezuelans. You still had money being channeled into these international programs that Chavez had set up. This was never supposed to be a national revolution. It was a global program, and the government has been very slow to adapt away from that. So I think that it's an oil story, but Venezuela is keenly affected in a way that other oil and other commodity economies have not been.
Michael McCarthy, Hugo Chavez, popular well beyond Venezuela's borders. His legitimacy coming from lifting people out of poverty. Is there any other way that the Venezuelan government in its current form can go forward?
It's a really interesting question. Sometimes people ask me whether or not I think that Hugo Chavez will be the 21st century equivalent of Che Guevara, that is to say, a symbol of positive struggle for left-wing change in Latin America. And in fact, this crisis in Venezuela is taking a big bite out of positive memory for Hugo Chavez. Polling reflects the fact that slightly more than 50% of Venezuelans now consider Hugo Chavez's his tenure in power as negative for the country. And his favorability readings in terms of whether or not he was a good leader for the country are also down. So I think that although Chavez was the glue for his movement, and his legacy continues to be the glue for his movement, I think that the country may actually be coming to a point where it's ready to move on. And that's a really important factor for thinking about what changes can take place in Venezuela going forward. And I think that change will have to include Chavistas without a doubt. I think that Chavismo will survive this crisis. It will definitely be negatively affected by it, but it's going to be a part of the future. The question, though, is for Venezuela, can there be a clearly post-Chavez era? And I think that
a post-Chavez era that brings both sides together. I'm going to interrupt you because we have to take a very quick break. We're going to pick up on that point because regional leaders have been asking about it, and we'll look at their statements and the responses when we come back in the France 24 debate.